Hey, it's Scott Weiss with Lessons on Leaving, your complete guide to funerals. Here today to talk to you again about this entire thing we call death and the funeral experience. A friend of mine, a great friend of mine from California, a man I really respect and appreciate, sent me an article this past week about how to plan an affordable funeral. It's a really good article. It's in his local newspaper. I want to go over it with you a little bit and then actually point out one glaring missing bit of information that should be the number one thing written here in this article. First thing he talks about is if you want to save money, well, the article was written because somebody wrote him a letter and said they were stuck with a $12,000 bill between this man and his sister had to spend $12,000 to bury their brother. And how did this happen? Well, this is what I've been talking about through all these blogs. How did we get to the point where we're spending $12,000 easy for a funeral? It ought to not be. One of the things he mentions here, the very first thing he says is to shop around before the need occurs. Of course, I'm completely an advocate of that, and I've even told you in a previous video blog that only 10% of people shop around. And the reasons that they pick funeral homes are location, religious or ethnic persuasions, and then because a relative was there. So actually, absolutely shop around and compare prices. The second thing he mentions in the article is to buy your own casket. I've talked to you about this as well. You can make your own casket, you can build it, you can buy your casket. There's places all over. You can, and there's no funeral, remember now, no funeral home can refuse your casket. They have to receive whatever container you provide. That's a federal law. The third thing he mentions here is direct burial. Direct burial, I've talked to you about it, just means you contract with the funeral home simply to have a burial. They don't do anything for services. They're not involved in any visitations. You do all that out separate, which is great. Cremation, again, is a way that people are saving money and what he recommends, and that's much less expensive than traditional funerals, but cremations can get expensive too if rental caskets, other things that you may be involved in. You could have just as much money spent in a cremation nowadays as a traditional burial. The fifth thing he mentions is green burial, which I'm a huge advocate of, and talked about a natural burial or green burial where you're going back to more of a preservation area, and we've talked about that and we will continue to talk about that in the future. The sixth thing he mentions is a veterans burial, not to neglect to take advantage of your veterans benefits. Remember, for veterans now, honorably discharged, when you reach the gate of that cemetery, everything is taken care of. The burial plot for you and your wife, typically, your markers, the opening and closing. So you'll have expenses at the funeral home, but if you are going to be buried in a veteran cemetery, everything's covered once you get to that cemetery. The seventh thing he talks about how to save money here is by body donation, which I've talked to you about as well. And typically very little, if any, cost whatsoever, but you would have to know that the remains of your loved one may not reach you ever, or they may reach you a year or so down the road in the form of the cremated remains, the cremains that would be left over. So all this is great, wonderful information, but I hate to use these same two little words with a hyphen in between them. It's called pre-plan. He does not mention to write this stuff down, to get this plan in place in writing where you can save this, where you can make copies like I've told you. That's why I stress over and over in these videos to get a copy of my pre-planning guide, my funeral planning guide. It's 11 pages, everything you're going to need to know. And the only way you get that is by subscribing to this newsletter. It's a must. You can print out as many copies as you need for your family. Tell other people about it. They can subscribe and they can get a funeral planning guide as well. I've done a lot of research on it. I'll put together everything you'll need to know. Much of it you may not, just leave that blank, but at least you'll have things in place. Because none of this matters if you don't get this written down, if you don't have a plan in action. You can know all about funeral costs, and you can know which one's less expensive, and you can know this is exactly what I want to do, and I'm going to save all this kind of money. But if it's not written down, and there's no communication, and people don't know, and God forbid you put it in your will, do not store or put your funeral plans in your will, because a will is typically read when? After the person has been buried. So again, sign up for my newsletter, get my funeral planning guide, get things in order, take control of the burial process and of your own funeral by doing some pre-planning. Scott Weiss, Lessons on Leaving, your complete guide to funerals. Please give me a comment on my website. Please share this information with friends. I just continually hear, almost on a weekly basis, weekly easily, but almost on a daily basis, the amount of money people are spending on funerals. It doesn't have to be that way. You don't have to go in there with no knowledge or understanding. Be glad to help you any way I can. Ask a comment. Give me a question. I had a question this week. Responded right away. Actually, I had more than one, but got those answers back. Thanks for all the new subscribers that are hearing this video blog or seeing it in their email box for the first time this week. We had several of you subscribe, so I appreciate that. And again, lessonsonleaving.com or scottveiss.com, and we'll see you next time.